Here we are, AP Biology, Chapter 13. We're starting to look at evolution and specifically how populations evolve. One of the most famous people ever for evolution is Charles Darwin. And what Charles Darwin was able to do is simply show us how is it that populations evolve. Now, some of the best examples that he documented are things like the blue-footed booby, which is this blue-footed bird that lives in the Galapagos Islands. And after studying the blue-footed booby, you'd ask yourself, why would they have blue feet? Well, it turns out that females are attracted to blue feet. And so it turns out that the brighter the blue, the more attractive the male is to the female, so the more likely that blue-footed booby is to pass on their genetics, and then will make more blue-footed booby offspring. And so it actually turns out that the blue feet is a really good characteristic or adaptation to have. Now, one of the things about Darwin and his theory of evolution is that he was able to observe a lot of animals that we don't see anywhere else in the world. For example, there's these iguanas that now swim. At this point in time, he had never seen or known of any iguanas that swim, but all of a sudden we can see a new species of iguana that can swim as a way of finding their little lettuce and salad underneath the water. And one of the big thing about Darwin is his main ideas were traced back to ancient Greeks. Aristotle, Judeo-Christian culture, all had believed that species were fixed in time, that they didn't change. And all of a sudden, Darwin came along and he said, no, wait a minute. These things are constantly changing. They're constantly evolving. And we can actually document this by looking at and using our eyes or fossils and things like that. Now, 100 years prior to Darwin, they had the study of fossils. So they had evidence that life things could change. And it wasn't until some geologists came along and said, wait a minute, Earth is really old, and the Earth has changed gradually over time. Putting those two ideas together, that if the Earth is changing very slowly, then possibly species can be changing slowly, and now we have fossils to look at that prove that change does happen over time. Now, Charles Darwin did his voyage on the HMS Beagle, the very famous ship in the 1830s. And what he found was, not only at the Galapagos Islands, but at every place he traveled, he looked at it, he saw similarities between animals and fossils that he had actually seen before. And so he was able to kind of piece it all together. Now, what he did was he used these travels not as the theory of evolution, but as a way of kind of developing the ideas that he later cultivated, thought about for 20 years, and then published. Now, what Darwin suggested as the mechanism or the machinery for evolution is natural selection. So what Darwin said is that, number one, organisms are going to produce more offspring than can possibly survive or be supported by the environment. And because these offspring are going to be slightly different, then what happens is that variation allows some to be better suited for surviving than others. With that in mind, some will have success and survive, pass on their genetics to the next generation, and some will just simply die off. And what he did was, he reasoned that this would ultimately result in certain traits being favored, and if they're favored, they're going to show up more and more often in generations as we move through in a population. What happened is he actually found some more evidence when he returned home to England, and some of it was the selective breeding of domesticated dogs and plants. So here we can see wild mushroom. If you actually cultivate and select for certain traits in this wild mushroom, you end up making the farm crops of broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts. All of these are the genetic offspring of this wild mustard. How do you do that? By simply selecting traits that you want, favoring them, and breeding it over and over again. The same thing happens when we look at domesticated dogs. All dogs' common ancestor is a wolf far enough back. Well, if you select certain traits like long ears and you keep breeding for long ears, eventually over time you're going to get a dog that has the leg or the ear length of a basset hound. Maybe you're selecting for big and you want to get a dog as big as the Bernese Mountain Dog. How do you do that? Well, you pick the biggest dog and you repeatedly breed it over and over. And eventually, generation after generation, it will become bigger and bigger. Now, the idea that was alarming is that he proposed that every single living species had descended from some earlier life form, and that nature was selecting which ones survived long enough to reproduce and pass on their traits. And so we actually have this ancestral kind of canine wolf type dog. And what happened is that over time, we selected different populations that live in different environments. And this ancestor ultimately became the African wild dog, the coyote, the wolf, the fox, and the jackal, all in different environments, all over different amounts of time. Now, how do we know where the evidence for evolution came from? That's going to be our topic for the next video. I'm going to stop here at the ending of Darwin, and we're going to continue chapter 13 with what is the evidence that we have for evolution.